Are we all ready? Okay. Hi, welcome. Hello. I'm Lia Newman. I'm the gallery director and curator here at the Avery Smith Galleries at Davidson College. Thank you for joining us. We are acknowledging that this is a strange setup and that we have a live audience and a Zoom audience and some Zoom panelists. So forgive us if we're kind of looking all over while we talk tonight. Thanks so much for joining us. This conversation is being held in conjunction with two projects with Nicholas Galanin. His new exhibition, which is in the Van Avery Smith Galleries now, called Dreaming in English. The exhibition is on view through December 9th. And we're hosting our opening reception tonight, so we hope that you will join us for that after the talk. We're also working on a second project with Nicholas, a year or so long project that will begin later this winter or late fall. And it involves several different collaborators, which is why we've invited a few folks here with us tonight. So I want to introduce everyone. Our first panelist is Dr. Rose Stremlau, who joins me live. Rose is an associate professor of history and gender and sexuality studies here at Davidson College. She specializes in the study of the Native South, women, families, gender and sexualities, and sexual violence in American history. Her first book, Sustaining the Cherokee Family, Kinship and the Allotment of an Indigenous Nation, was published by the University of North Carolina Press, won the Willie Lee Rose Prize for the best book on Southern history, and has been included in the Cherokee Nation's own history course. Her current project bridges the Atlantic and Pacific worlds through the story of a Cherokee woman born in the Old Nation before the Trail of Tears, who participated in the California Gold Rush and who witnessed the overthrow of the Hawaiian monarchy by the US. Stremlau has published over a dozen articles and essays. She's contributed to as many public history and community-driven projects and has won funding for her work from a range of prestigious organizations, including the National Endowment for the Humanities. Yes. Next, joining us in Zoom, I want to introduce DeLesslin Rue George Warren. George Warren is a queer artist, speaker, and organizer from the Catawba Nation, whose artwork includes performance and installation art. Since 2017, they have worked for their tribal community on several projects, including the Catawba Language Project, the Catawba Food Sovereignty Project, and have helped develop learning continuums for Catawba education and justice programs and public school teacher training. George Warren's longest ongoing project has been their Indigenous Core of Discovery Tour, which presents unsettling tours of collections and museums, bringing to the forefront stories of Indigenous peoples, colonization, and survivance. The tour began in 2016 at the Smithsonian's Presidential Portrait Gallery and has also visited the Utah Museum of Fine Arts Go West exhibition. In 2016, they were recognized as a 25 under 25 by United National Intertribal Youth. In 2017, selected as a Dream Starter by Running Strong for American Indian Youth, and in 2018 recognized as the 40 under 40 in Indian country by the National Council on Indian Enterprise Development. So welcome, George Warren. And last but not least, of course, I want to introduce Nicholas Galanin, whose work is really bringing us all together. Over the past 2 decades, Galanin has worked across media, materials, and processes, engaging past, present, and future to expose widespread misappropriation and commodification of Indigenous visual culture, the impact of colonialism, intentionally obscured collective memory, and barriers to the acquisition of knowledge. His practice, as you'll see tonight in his presentation and also in the gallery exhibition, encompasses diverse media and techniques, including sculpture, installation, photography, video, performance, printmaking, textiles, and more. Galanin holds a BFA from London Guildhall University in jewelry design, an MFA in Indigenous Visual Arts from Massey University in New Zealand, and has apprenticed with master carvers and jewelers in his own community in Sitka, Alaska. His work has been exhibited widely, including in the prestigious 2019 Whitney Biennial at the Whitney Museum of American Art in New York, the Native American Pavilion during the 2017 Venice Biennale, the 2019 Honolulu Biennial in Hawaii, the Anchorage Museum in Alaska, and many more. And we are so happy to add the Van Avery Smith Galleries at Davidson College to that very prestigious list. As part of the group exhibition, Art for a New Understanding, Native Voices, 1950s to Now, Galanin's work traveled to Crystal Bridges Museum of American Art, the Memphis Brooks Museum of Art, the Nasher Museum of Art at Duke University here in our own state of North Carolina, and the Museum of Contemporary Native Arts in Santa Fe. His work is included in many public and private collections, including MoMA in New York, the Art Institute of Chicago, the Detroit Institute of Arts, LACMA, the Museum of Fine Arts Houston, and the list goes on and on. We are thrilled to have him join us tonight, and I should say that he is represented by Peter Bloom Gallery, who's been great help with the exhibition, and he's joining us from his home in Sitka, Alaska. So welcome.
Thank you.
Those are some really long introductions for some amazing panelists, but I thought we could start by turning it over to Nicholas to talk a little bit more about his work and kind of provide the foundation for the conversation tonight.
Ganishchish, Yehiatsin, Yuhat, Duasak, Shluknahadi, Hatsati, Kagwantan Yadi Ayachat, Shika Kwan. My name is Yehiatsin, Nicholas Galanin. I am Shluknahadi, child of the Kagwantan people of Sitka. I'm here today calling from my home, Sitka, Alaska, and I'm just going to put this screen share on. Before I get started, can you all hear me all right? Okay, good. So yeah, this is home, and I always like to start off with sharing images of where I come from, images of the land, the sea. This is such an abundant place that provides for our families and communities since time immemorial. The land shapes us and it shapes our cultures if we listen. I continually am engaged in that relationship with the land and history, and it streams through my creative work. So we live in healthy ways here with the seasons. The salmon run, and that is a large part of our schedule of our summer months of harvesting. We don't buy a lot of protein and meat from the grocery stores. We're out hunting and fishing and doing those things. So that's more of the calendar that I feel like we're meant to operate on, opposed to the crazy calendars that society has built for us through just through the crazy lives that we're leading right now. So, this is some of the projects that I had been working on previously through community work and Continuum. I've worked with my uncle, my father, their mentors, doing this cultural work and carving for over 20 something years. This is a recent totem that was raised in Juneau, Akbe. The on Douglas Island. Wanted to share this story with you. In the 60s, the Tlingit Clan House Village was intentionally burnt down to make way for a boat harbor. And these are recent histories and stories that basically summarize the building of a nation, summarize American history, summarize our indigenous realities and experiences of fighting against intentional amnesia of our voices and our histories and our stories. So, you know, this pole being raised on that village site today was, you know, the first recent marker of that continued colonization project and process that's happening amongst all of our communities today. This is a project I'm working on right now. I started this 10 months ago. It's a dugout canoe. I'm working with my cousin, who's an apprentice, Lee Burkhart, and my uncle, Will Burkhart, who's always, you know, has been my mentor forever. So, and we started this project in January. We're preparing to steam it maybe next week. It's been quite a process. These dugout canoes are created from old growth Western red cedar trees. Those trees are becoming far more difficult to find. And yeah, it's the canoes have they're forms of they're backbones to our culture in a lot of ways, because they allow us to subsist and sustain and travel and survive in these environments across the seas. And this tree itself is older than America. It's probably 600 or 700 years old. So that's sort of the projects that I've been working on right now, and wanted to jump into some of these works at this exhibition at Davidson right now. This series, Fair Warning, is something that a lot of us as Indigenous artists, our community members might be familiar with, and that's our relationship to institutions. As a apprentice in my earlier years of studying and, you know, seeking and searching more information on my history and my culture, a lot of our objects, our ceremonial objects, have been forcefully or removed or stolen or sold from our communities into institutions around the globe. This market and trade continues on today still. There's this series was taken at the Natural History Museum and American Natural History Museum in New York, and I caught their de-installation of our objects as they're remodeling the Great Hall, except first time in 75 years. So, you know, it was kind of perfect for this project to sneak in there and take some photos of these empty spaces. The audio that plays alongside these images is audio recorded from auction houses. Auction houses that exchange and trade cultural objects and commodified or fetishized objects created from our cultures and our history and communities. So a lot of times the value and exchange of value is done without our communities and by any means. So the trade of these objects and these auction houses. But the work for me envisions a future where we don't have to connect with our culture in these institutional spaces. For me, the work demonstrates, you know, possibilities where we can return all of our ancestral objects back to the communities that care for them. They're not cared for in ways that our communities are able to. Yes, the temperature and the humidity and the light might be a thing that's controlled in these spaces, but the spiritual care for them is not. And that connects all the way back to those images of relationship to place, relationship to land, and caring for land in the same way as these objects. So all of this is connected. All this is connected into our language. All this is connected into our ceremonies, our songs, our dance. This series of monoprints created for this exhibition, Dreaming in English, is a series that I've referred to the process in my work when I create these as memory, and the process of embedded memory that can access through understanding what that relationship is, through understanding the deep connections to place, deep connections to process of surviving and living amongst and on land. And it's the work's gestural. I reference memory in this process, like the memory of the muscle memory that we might understand when we harvest from the land, the muscle memory that we might understand when we work with our ancestral tools, muscle memory that the deep connections of joy that we might feel pass through us when we are part of that continuum. That's what this work is for me, and it's not ever something that you can clearly focus on. You can just acknowledge it and acknowledge that it's being passed through you and carried with you. So some of these are maybe abstract images of dance, of figures, of ceremony, of our ceremonial objects, of the tools required to honor and share that connection. And a lot of those tools in this image on the left are tools that we use to create those objects. The tools are just as important as the objects for the makers. So adzes and knives and all of those things that get us there and make those connections. So, and then on the right, the image maybe of forms of canoes and traveling to ceremony. There's a reference to cities with these figures. Instead of them being just paddlers, they become these other larger structures. So, but that's this work to me is one way of connecting some of these conversations, I suppose, through gestural drawing and monotype printmaking. So this work is part of the participatory installation that I'm asking I'm asking viewers of the exhibition to install. This is an image from boarding schools, and of course the process of forced assimilation amongst our indigenous communities that was not only unique to the US, it's across Canada and even in other indigenous communities internationally as well. But the process of kill the Indian, save the man, the genocide of the process of genocide. And this exhibition is a reference to how this is continually ongoing and how we may see that participation even existing today in today's society. So a lot of times when we think back to certain eras, we're like, how did these communities allow this to happen? And sometimes people are just doing their jobs, they say, in that reference, or their, these other belief systems that are perpetuate and uphold that violence towards in this conversation case, our indigenous communities. We face that conversation every day, living on and amongst indigenous lands and indigenous territories. Settler communities have to, if they choose to, I suppose, navigate what that means. And this works a reference to that, as these beds are assembled across the gallery space, reference to the beds that these indigenous children slept on in boarding schools. Access to the work becomes blocked immediately. Access to engage with the pieces that hold some of these other stories and stuff, our content, our knowledge, or history become blocked by these realities of these beds. And the term dreaming in English is a reference to a lot of things. It's a reference to what the removal of language from our generations, the process of removing that language violently. It's a reference to when you learn a new language, that when some people refer to, once you dream in that language, you have another understanding of it. It's also a reference to, I think about these spaces and these histories and these children, and what it must have been like to even be laying in these beds pulled from your family and just, staring at the ceiling, trying to process all of these things that are, all of the violence that's being placed upon you and your families. So the work continues today. How are we doing for time?
I think we're doing okay. Well, what time is it? Let's see. I think we have a few more minutes, right? To keep.
Okay, I'll just be swift here. I don't want to take up too much time, but this is an image from Seattle during CHOP and the anti-police brutality protests that were sweeping the globe. In this image is Rick Williams, the brother of John T. Williams, who was extrajudicially murdered by Officer Ian Burke of the Seattle Police Department in 2010, I believe. Here he is at this protest 10, 11 years later. These histories aren't new. These histories are, they're continuations of generations. And the rules might be bent or changed, or the basis of these things, but the conversations are continual. The work that I created during that time for the Biennale of City is titled Unshadowed Land and Excavation of Bush Burial. It's an excavation of the James Cook statue at Hyde Park in Sydney. On the monument and statue is a bronze plaque that reads, it's a discovery plaque. So this work is referencing, the problematic and propaganda of colonial monuments and histories and how they're told, how they're sold. And the process of this burial of this monument is to remove it, but it's doing so in archaeological dig. It's reference to archaeology as a historical process that also has upheld white supremacist beliefs through narratives that are told. It's a the reality that when you dig down to bury this statue, you're going to actually uncover evidence that contradicts the discovery plaque, which is some of the oldest civilization in the world. Objects that can be found still. And, the work is also a way of talking about these conversations without actually including the statue or the monument. One of the general arguments that you'll hear is, we'll lose our history if we remove it. And I would argue that there's been a lot of critical conversation happening around that without the statue present at all. So this is a response to communities oftentimes seen globally during the contention of these problematic figures that are, all over colonial government lands, occupied lands, and oftentimes it's more of an upholding of a belief, I would say, than the actual physical object itself. So, and then recent work, Never Forget, installed on Cahuilla land, or Desert X Biennial. Indian land is in the scale of the Hollywood land sign. The original Hollywood sign was put up as an advertisement for white-only real estate development. And this work is, obviously pulling from that iconic imagery, and it's doing so to scale. Though the work here is not the actual sign, the work is the call to action. So oftentimes, as you know, land acknowledgement has become popular and becoming more common, especially in institutional spaces. Though land acknowledgement is nothing without action, direct action towards contributions towards land back movements, direct action towards contributions towards real rent initiatives and other indigenous needs from communities. So direct action, and that's what this work was. So GoFundMe was set up to raise funds to acquire legal title of sacred sites in partnership with NALC, Native American Land Conservancy, and return land back to indigenous stewardship. I think over $50,000 has been raised so far. So I feel like far more selfies have been taken in front of this work than donations of dollars, which is, something that I understood was likely going to happen. It's a form of, I suppose, it's a Trojan horse of sorts through social media and infiltrating algorithms to bring these conversations into these spaces. So, but with that, I'll let us continue on into some more conversations here. So,
thank you so much. So I think that lays a good foundation. I'm glad you ended with those works, the outdoor pieces, because I want to sort of transition the conversation to talk about what we're doing here at Davidson and how it sort of relates to our own history. So I thought I would just turn it over to you and Rue and Nicholas to kind of talk about that. So
fabulous. So I'm going to talk both to our virtual audience and talk to the folks who aren't here. So pardon me if this does seem at times awkward. I want to share my attention with everyone. So Lia asked me to talk today about the history of the college in relationship to the native people of this region and the colonization of the Carolinas. And so I'm going to talk about that for a few minutes, especially in light of the college's recent work through our Commission on Race and Slavery in very intentionally interrogating the relationship of the college's founders in the first few decades of the college's faculty and staff and students to enslavement. I will leave the focus on Catawba history to Rue and turn the conversation over to them in a few moments. But I did want to make a few points about the colonization of the Carolinas, again, in relationship to those who founded Davidson and were part of this institution's community in the first decades. In a way, this is excavating another kind of story to build on those about our past and our history that we've uncovered in the last few years. And the first point that I want to emphasize is that the founding families of this college were deeply involved in the colonization of the Carolinas. And so there's a couple of ways that we can think about that. And first is to understand that in 1700, most of the Carolinas were native homelands. And by the end of the American Revolution, that's no longer true. The change is caused by a series of brutal scorched earth wars that begin in 1711 with what's called the Tuscarora War and continue through the American Revolution and into what's today Tennessee until 1794. No less than William Lee Davidson is part of that process. He earns status and it begins his military career engaging in part of these attacks during the Revolution, scorched earth attacks on the Cherokee Lower Towns, which are today in Western South Carolina. And so we can think about the process of warfare as interconnected with an equally brutal and violent destruction of life caused by enslavement. Now, some folks in this room are probably old enough to remember learning about the virgin soil theory, perhaps in grade school or high school, and the idea that epidemic diseases introduced to coastal regions of North America by explorers, by sailors, decimated native populations before many native people in the interior saw a settler face. Scholarship in the last dozen or so years on the Carolinas suggests that that's really not true for this region. And the catastrophic depopulation that took place, especially in the 18th century, is a product of warfare, and much of that warfare is associated with enslavement. And that native people who are sold out of Charlestown, now Charleston, many of them taken to British slave posts in Barbados, are part of this larger story of depopulation, but it's disease introduced into native communities as part of these wars of slavery that also have a catastrophic impact. So by the 1760s, native people across the Carolinas are signing treaties. And they're doing that in part because depopulation has had a terrible impact on their communities. This is not coincidentally the time where many of the founding families of Davidson College are establishing their farms and plantations in this region. So again, these processes are intimately connected. Now, it's in the aftermath of the American Revolution, the Treaty of Hopewell, which is signed at Hopewell Plantation in South Carolina in 1785, that creates a peace, if you will, between the new United States government and Native people in the South. And this is a very awkward peace at best. George Washington's Secretary of War, a man named Henry Knox, theorized that the United States simply couldn't afford to be at war with Native peoples on its western frontier. And Knox was acknowledging the reality that the United States had a very small military and that Native people, especially those across the crest of the Appalachians, still had considerable military strength. And so Knox envisions a policy that ultimately comes to be called civilization. This is, as I explained to my students, with friends like this, who needs enemies policy, because the idea was that Native people could assimilate and become part of the United States, but they would have to give up their sovereignty, their separate nations, their religions, their languages, their family organization. They would, in other words, have to assimilate into Anglo-American culture. Most Native people were not enthusiastic about this idea. Many Christian missionaries were, and particularly Presbyterians who worked through an organization called the American Board of Commissioners for Foreign Missions, the ABCFM. And the ABCFM was supported by donations from Presbyterian churches, including here in the Carolinas. In fact, the first mission to Native people in the South, which also in reference to Nicholas's work, included a boarding school for children, was funded by a tour done by the founding missionary here in the western part of the Carolinas. And so those same folks then who donated the funds to start the college would have been supporters of this effort. Now, on the one hand, these folks, especially in the early decades of the 1800s, recognized in Native people a common humanity. They thought that Native people had souls, no less than white folks did. Again, on the other hand, they very much were ethnocentric in their views and expected Native people to assimilate into Anglo-American culture. In the early 1800s, those folks have the dominant voice in Indian policy in DC. As the decades pass, they are replaced by those folks who no longer see a shared humanity. This will play out in American politics. It will also play out in the Presbyterian Church. Ultimately, the church divides over issues related to slavery, but Indian removal and the treatment of Native people, especially in the Southeast, is really the test run for these larger questions, both of whether or not people who are, and the term increasingly emerges into popular discourse, perceived as racially different, share a common humanity for these missionaries, right? Is it worth trying to convert them? But then this comes into play in terms of larger issues of sovereignty. Washington's civilization policy recognized the sovereignty of tribes. It didn't consider them to be equal to the United States, but certainly recognized both the humanity and agency of Native peoples. By the time we get to the Jacksonian era, that's no longer the case. Now, it shouldn't be a surprise to anyone who knows anything about Native history that Jackson's not a popular guy in my field of scholarship. But we shouldn't give Jackson too much credit for theorizing the ideas that ultimately culminate in the removal of many of the larger Native nations from the East, especially following his signing of the Indian Removal Act in May of 1830. What Jackson does well is he becomes the popular political voice for a movement that really began in Jefferson's administration. It was Jefferson and the purchase of Louisiana in 1803 that began to articulate, well, if Native people don't want to assimilate, maybe we can just put them over there, right? Being on the opposite side of the Mississippi River and introducing this idea of a permanent segregation of the Native population from the settler population of the United States, but also giving a nod to those folks who were saying that state sovereignty or states' rights, as it's going to emerge in the 1850s in relationship to slavery, and that debate trumps the federal government's authority over tribal affairs. And of course, they articulate this in terms of white supremacy. So by the 1830s, the shared humanity of settlers and Native people, who many of those Native people as converts to Christianity pray to the same God, is no longer taken as a self-evident truth, including by many Presbyterians. And so we see then when Davidson is established in 1837, and our first student organizations are founded, the debating societies, right? So Phi and U, is that the students are immersed in this larger conversation that, again, ultimately will transfer to questions over the humanity of enslaved people. But it begins with debates over the humanity of Native people. So it might be interesting for people to realize that these debating societies in the first few years, more than any other topic, more even than slavery, debated Indian policy and Indian removal. Now, again, this reflects larger schisms that are emerging in the Presbyterian Church that are going to play out over several decades, but it also reflects some of the local issues that are taking place in this region. So Davidson College was founded by 3 presbyteries. One of them, the Bethel Presbytery in what's today York County, South Carolina, was, it seems from the research that we're doing, established by folks who were involved in defrauding Catawba folks from their land. Now, again, there's lots of debates in this time over sovereignty. state versus federal, but also tribal. Rue is by far the expert on this, so I'll let him explain it. But it certainly does seem that the families who were part, again, of one of our founding presbyteries were involved in land fraud against Catawba people. And one of the ways that we can understand this in the larger culture of settler colonization in the South is to understand that white folks didn't see Native people as equal citizens. They didn't see them as having the same rights as they did, and also understood that the legal system as it existed, especially in the 1820s, 1830s, 1840s, didn't recognize the rights of non-white people to their land or to representation. And so the larger religious, social, and political culture in which Davidson College was established was very much a part of this larger culture of Indian dispossession and Indian removal. And so even though the college as a corporate entity isn't directly implicated, certainly founding families were part of this process, but also people in the time of the college's establishment and in those early decades of the college's existence were supportive of the larger processes of Indian dispossession. And so with that, I want to turn it over to the person who knows far more about Catawba history, and that is Rue.
Hello, Tanake Nitem, Niat DeLesslin George Warren, Niat Nitem Brew, Ye Ismare, Ye Kataware, Ye Kampisawachahare. Hello. Hi, everyone. My name is Rue. I'm a citizen of Catawba Nation. And I think you might have oversold my expertise, Dr. Stremlau. I am a citizen of Catawba Nation. I also work for my tribe on a variety of things, including food sovereignty, language revitalization, education, whatever they need me to. And then I also work as an artist and a presenter. But I call myself a storyteller, which means that I get away with not knowing dates and getting to make outlandish claims, which my historian friends can't necessarily do. So that's a little bit about me. I'm not, we're running late on time, so I don't know how much time I want to take up because I want to make sure that we have time to talk about the awesome project that we're working on. But is there something specifically you want me to respond to really quickly? Because there was lots of really interesting things in what you said.
Should we have Nicholas talk a little bit more about Unshadowed Land? And then, then maybe Rue could jump in on some of the decisions that were made related to the project.
Sure. Yeah. Unshadowed Land is a project that we will be building on site. Their extension of Shadow on the Land and excavation and bush burial, which I shared with you. This work, again, is working directly with land. It's working with political figures, histories, and settler colonial narratives. For Unshadowed Land, the monument that will be removed from the landscape in the area that is the shadow of the Andrew Jackson and Lafayette Square monument, which was also recently, I think, in the media. If you caught the what did that say on there? The text that was just painted onto it recently, and it's been a site for many interventions, anyways. So. But yeah, the work will be planting a garden in the shadow of that monument. And for me, there's a few metaphors here. One is, that we need light to grow, and for a shadow of such a figure, such a history, and such a act, I suppose, that has continually shaped and removed our communities, there's immense resilience for that growth, and it's a reference to that. It's a reference to what's growing. It's a reference to what that sustains, whom it sustains, and for me, that's continuum and it's multi-generational. So in this case, it'll be, you know, the Catawba Corn, and then I'm up we have the actual brew. If you want to help me with the title of the type of corn, that would be great, because we've been discussing ways to transform this plot in this space, and for me, I think that's a, you know, a garden and something that'll be grown and shared with the Catawba community is a large part of the process of this. That is a direct reference to resilience. It's a direct reference to our communities surviving despite these intentions, surviving in these spaces, these ways, despite these plans and goals that we still struggle with today in our communities and our fight for, whether it's subsistence rights, clean water, whether it's for access to land. You know, it varies across the states really, but even some communities fighting for federal recognition, which is, you know, another form of complete erasure. So, and it's, I don't have a visual to share with that right now, but it's a, I mean, feel free to jump in here with some more.
Yeah. So
Thank you.
Maybe Rose, I mean, one of the things that happened, I think, when you started talking about the project, Nicholas, was this weird coincidence of the site that we selected, which we selected the site because it was adjacent to our building. It felt public. The piece will be installed next to the Visual Arts Center. But then there were all these really wonderful sort of organic things that happened that we learned. So maybe Rose could share a little bit about the location, and then maybe Rue could talk about where we landed on the actual thing we're going to grow.
Right. So if you all can envision an excavation of the outline of the Jackson statue from Lafayette Square, right on that side of the Visual Arts Center. When Lia first suggested this idea, that this is incredibly appropriate, again, as we excavate the college's history in relationship to Native peoples, but also because Andrew Jackson was born just down the road, right, in the Waxhaws, on the boundary between North and South Carolina. And he's the first Presbyterian president of the United States. There's been 8 Presbyterian presidents, for those of you keeping count. He's the first. And so he really does represent a significant movement for Presbyterianism in our nation's history. As well, there's a presidential tie to this place, in that the house of the college president in the 1850s was located on this site. And this area here was a kitchen garden in which enslaved women worked along with women of the president's household to grow food, not only for that family, but also to feed the trustees when they visited, because they stayed in that house with the president and his family, and with local faculty. And so the memory of this land and being a place of perhaps Catawba cornfields at one point, but certainly land that was worked by enslaved people for the benefit of this college, we thought was both significant and important. Of course, we weren't sure what to grow, and we're so grateful to have the knowledge and expertise of Rue, who took this idea and made wonderful suggestions, and will explain some of the ways in which this idea has evolved into what you will see over the end of this year and the next.
Whoa. Yeah, let's see if we can condense 5,000 years of corn history down to just a few minutes. So I have a picture kind of in my picture of some examples of Catawba corn, Cus Catawbare. And this is a corn variety that has been cultivated by Catawbas and our relatives in the Southeast for millennia, thousands of years before Hernando de Soto first walked through these lands. It is different from the corn that most contemporary Americans interact with in that it's not a sweet corn, right? So it's a flour corn. So this would be used in soups, it'd be used in breads, and it also requires a particular kind of process, which has the fun name nixtamalization, which comes from either a Mayan or Aztec word, I can't remember which one. But through this process, corn transforms from a typical grass that's not super healthy for humans because we didn't evolve for dealing with grass, into something that could actually become the basis of an entire diet because it's fully nutritious, right? So Catawbas cultivate this corn for millennia, but then as the landscape is transforming, as Dr. Stremlau was just talking about, in the 1700s, the 1800s, and the 1900s, the production of this corn reduces over time. Kind of the last moment that this corn was cultivated in our community was in the 70s, 80s, and early 90s. But it was also at this period that schools in South Carolina were desegregated. And so it was the first time that Catawbas are attending schools, that young Catawbas are not able to work in gardens, help to cultivate these foods, which, I think sometimes we would think of that as just like child labor, but it's also a form of education, right? Like this interacting with the land, the cultivating of food, the taking care of family. And, the downside of Catawbas and other indigenous peoples becoming part of the public education system is that a lot of the time we don't have time to educate our own people about our history, about our foodways, about our different practices. So by the 90s, kind of when I was born, Catawba corn was no longer being grown. And so flash forward to 2018, we are gathering together different parts of Catawba Nation. Just like any other government, there's different divisions and departments. And so we have the clinic who's working on healthy eating. We have the cultural center that's working on traditional foods. We have our wellness program that's working on gardening and healthy living. So all these people that are already working on food sovereignty, right? The Catawba food system. And we get everyone together to talk about how we can work in coordination. And the first thing that everyone said that I talked to, elders, people, Catawbas who are working in the tribal government, was we need to get the Catawba corn back. And so I heard about this guy at University of South Carolina, Dr. David Shields. I reached out to him. I said, we're looking for Catawba corn. I hear you know a lot about Southeastern seed varieties. And he said, I'll look into it. And I was like, sure, he'll never look into it. 3 months later, I get an email from him that he's found this variety of corn that we can't prove 100% that it's Catawba corn, but it is the same number of rows. It matches the same kind of description. And the family that it was collected from in Hickory, North Carolina, the Leal family, said that they got this corn from the Indians. And of course, Catawbas were the only tribe in the area during that time in the kind of mid-early 1800s. And so this corn came back to our community thanks to the University of North Carolina Extension Office that was actually growing it out as part of their grain trials. It came back to our community in 2018. We grew it in 2019 and 2020. And as you can see, it's absolutely beautiful, like every color you can possibly imagine in the rainbow. But the other thing that I kind of have been amazed by with this corn is that it also brings knowledge about how our ancestors practiced agriculture. So before, growing this variety of corn, one of my big questions was like, how did Catawbas grow corn? Because if you're familiar with contemporary corn agriculture, it requires a lot of water. And so I can't imagine Catawbas getting big clay pots, dipping them in the river, and then pouring them on. No, that doesn't make any sense, right? Like, who has time for that? And what we've learned from the corn, because we had to plant it right as COVID was starting and no one could go out and water it, is that it doesn't need extra watering. It is able to produce fully on just the rain that we receive in the Southeast over the summer. And so even during COVID, when no one was able to take care of this corn, the land itself was able to take care of it. So what I'm excited about with this project is that we're able to bring the corn back up to the land that Davidson is on. And then also that Davidson will be able to help us increase the amount of seed we have for the corn, and that can actually come back to Catawba Nation because we have immense interest from our citizens, from our farm, from lots of folks in making this corn something that we're growing regularly.
Well, I know we're getting close on time, and I'm sure that there are questions. Are there some questions in the audience and maybe in the chat? But I wanted to ask sort of a general question for everybody, which is really about, I think, Nicholas, you sort of alluded to this in some way, that the project of Desert X, it's more than just like an art installation. There's an activist component to it, and there's a desire for real change and something real to happen out of the project, which includes, in that particular project, raising money for real rent initiatives and land back and things like that. And so I'm trying to think about, like, what are our hopes for this project? I know I have some thoughts about how, what I hope will happen, and sort of the relationship that I think we're building between an artist, an Indigenous artist in Alaska, and connecting to our own, to the Catawba here. But do folks have thoughts about that, Nicholas, in terms of like your hope for it, or Rue?
I mean, I feel like it's taken such a, it's brought together so many knowledgeable folks here right now to like even contribute and share these histories and stories, that it's already in motion. It's working. Like it's that's the intention of a lot of these works, is to tell these stories and have them shared in these spaces. But beyond stories, it's, we're referencing in this conversation the importance of not just histories, but the importance of relationships to food sovereignty, sustenance, culture, and our future generations. And I feel like this work has the ability to tie some of those things together. For me, I'm excited about the possibility of a larger plot of land or space farm to cultivate, and assist in pushing this further faster than just the plot of the land on the visual shadow of the Jackson Monument. So,
yeah, I would. Thank you. Yeah, I would add also, something that's becoming really popular, or like people are starting to hear about it at least, is this phrase "land back." It was even featured in Reservation Dogs, which is one of the two new amazing, native-led television shows. Check it out if you haven't. But this idea of land back, right? Bringing land that has been taken from Indigenous peoples back to those Indigenous communities. And I think one part of the conversation that this is engaging with is part of colonization has been the transformation of landscapes into property. And so does land back, does this good relationship between Davidson and Catawba Nation mean just the literal return of property title, or does it mean the creation of relationships between Catawba Nation and Davidson for the mutual benefit of the land, the mutual use of the land for many generations to come? And, coming from a Catawba viewpoint, I feel kind of more at the latter. So that's what I'm excited about, is the ongoing relationship and what we can figure out from that.
I'd like to add to that conversation of land back and the land back movement as well, is it's, there's more than just physical or legal title, a transfer of that involved in this movement and the conversations and ideas. And I think some of that's underlined here, and that's in relationship to what the land provides, or how we engage and have a relationship with that place to, build our communities, our culture, and sustain. So I feel like this harnesses other aspects of it that might not be so politically loud or politically like jarring, but necessary, really necessary.
Yeah, my hope is that the many sincere questions that I hear around campus, which often come down to, what should I say in a land acknowledgement? That we can transition that conversation to, I think, what is the more important question, which is, what does a right relationship with Native people in this region, first and foremost the Catawba, look like, and how is that relationship rooted in a shared stewardship of this land, but also the young people in whom we are all invested. And I think if we can ask that latter question with sincerity and hear those answers from Native people and act on those in good faith, then the words of a land acknowledgement will be apparent in our actions. That's going to be a long process, but I'm very hopeful that the involvement of many folks in this project over the next year will move us towards that conversation in a spirit of good faith and fellowship.
I want to make sure that we leave a couple of minutes for questions. If folks have either questions about any of the history we've talked about, if you have questions for Nicholas specifically about his work, either in the exhibit or anything he's talked about. No questions? This is usually a chatty group, so I assume that there will be.
And I'm glad to talk history later after we're done. So if anyone wants to ask Nicholas and Rue questions, please, let's focus on them.
Hi, I don't know much about indigenous studies, but I'm a child specialist, but I am involved with food, and nixtamalization is I'm very familiar with, because it was indigenous knowledge that made the Mayans, like we said. But I'm curious how much of that indigenous knowledge is still present among the elders, because especially with climate change, there's been a push towards the hybrid, the old, getting away from. Because like you said, we need to have sources of food that are more sustainable and don't need tons of water and things like that. And I'm excited to hear about and see your project on the Catawba Corn. But how much of the indigenous knowledge is there? Because it's been many years.
Yeah, hello. It's interesting because, well, I'll say, like, for example, nixtamalization, it's still there in
Flavors.
Yeah, in flavors, but also, some of the folks that work, I'm thinking of someone specifically that I talked to when we were working on this, who could still remember her parents throwing wood ash into the pot with the corn. Which is a nixtamalizing process, right? Because the alkalinity in the wood ash creates the nixtamalization process. And so there's still that knowledge, but I think what we've lost, and she was really growing up in this period when Catawba's transitioned from parents community being in charge of education to the public education system being in charge. That's the same period in which she didn't have the context of why this process was done and why it was important. On the other hand, something we talked a lot about in my community is that a lot has been taken from us through colonization, through incentives, through violence, through dispossession, through lots of different methods. And while we mourn that loss, we also have a responsibility to the future generations, which is to take these pieces of culture that our ancestors were able to preserve in the face of colonization and reweave them into a basket, into something that can hold our future generations. And so while we don't have the specifics of nixtamalization still in our community, we can still learn from other indigenous communities. We can still learn from contemporary science, but most importantly, we can still learn from the land. And that's where a lot of our work is focused on, is relearning from the land that we actually come from. Thank you for the question.
Hey, just building on that, it's so much of the leadership around climate in our country is from within the indigenous community, and such as we look at pipelines and conservation efforts, so much of that leadership is coming from that community. So I wondered if that was something you guys talked about as part of your potential call to action too.
Marcus?
Well, I feel like it's embedded in our relationship to and responsibility to place always. So it wasn't like a head-on, this is what it is and how it is, but I think it's apparent that it's tied into all of these things. So we're gonna engage with place these ways. That responsibility is, becomes centered through care. And I feel like one of the struggles that we contend with when dealing with ongoing colonization and capitalist society is when people are so disconnected from things that they it becomes really easy to I suppose not care for it. And I feel like connection is so important in many ways, and when we understand what that is, and the care for these things isn't going to be something that we have to fight for. Literally, we have people on front lines that are, getting felonies for, fighting for clean water, fighting for access for things that really shouldn't even be a question. So environmental activism is not terrorism.
Yes. Oh, go ahead.
No.
Oh, I was just going to add that, one of the things to understand about colonialism is that one of the goals, one of the ways that it works is by separating people from land, whether it's people who are removed from their landscapes and sold into slavery, whether it's people who are co-opted because of economic precarity to become settlers, as happened with several populations that the United Kingdom took over. All of these processes are meant to break people apart from their relationships, particularly with land. And for Indigenous communities, we've been fighting to maintain those relationships for the breadth of colonialism. And so that's why, like Nicholas was saying, it's inherent to our understanding of who we are is this connection to the land. And then the other part, just following up on what he said at the end, is that when you listen to the claims from these Indigenous protectors, these are actually basic scientific facts, which is water is life. We literally do not know of life that exists without water. We are all relatives. That is literally true, right? Darwin said it, right? And so when Indigenous people are making these statements, we're not making, like a peace, love, and happiness sort of statement, but a literal statement about the ability for us to continue into the future as a species, as ecosystems, and as a planet. So those are some of my thoughts.
Thank you.
There's a question for Nicholas, asking about the Desert X project, asking how you first came to that project and what your feelings were relating artistically to the desert coming from such a wet climate.
I was invited to propose a project into Desert X 2019, I believe. So, this project was over 3 years in the making. And like many of these spaces, especially when you're going to work or engage with land, I feel like it's, there's a lot to consider when you visit a community and go to the spaces. So one of the things that is apparent to me too is the land art movement as the art canon, Western art canon, would define is clear, has largely missed Indigenous interactions and engagements with what you could argue is probably some of the oldest land art existing still in our times, and some of the most deeply connected forms of land art. So that didn't miss me when I looked at how we have been largely removed from those conversations. But my initial visit out there was, what narrative was being chosen and whose history and story is being upheld in the general community. And one large one that was immediate was, this Hollywood history, and this idea that Hollywood stars would run to Palm Springs for their getaway, and that the desert was empty and vast. And the obviously immediate things that have been missed is the indigenous histories and the complex, everywhere we go across the US, the relationship politically to land history is very different. It's, in Alaska, we don't really we have one reservation. In Alaska, we didn't have any lands. We were upon the sale of Alaska from Russia to the US. Indigenous communities were left out of that conversation. And it wasn't until later that we had the Alaska Native Lands Claims Act, which was now put us into this position where we have corporations that manage our land. It's unreal. This is our reality. And the relationship shifted from that to the corporatization of land use. But long story short, understanding and learning the Agua Caliente's history, they're one of the most they have a large amount of land compared to a lot of other indigenous communities. And then we have landless indigenous communities. So this whole spectrum of history and stuff. Tie that into the relationship of Hollywood. Hollywood as a institution that still perpetuates stereotype, that still perpetuates narratives and stories that largely miss us in our communities. That's why, yes, shout out to Sterling Harjo and Reservation Dogs. Sterling's a friend of mine, and I love to see that this representation in those spaces, because it hasn't really been something that we've ever had in our communities, and it's important. But yeah, so taking on the history of Hollywood, taking on the history of that institution that became iconic to this American dream of sorts, and the history of the sign itself being a land advertisement for segregated white-only land buyers, settler communities on stolen indigenous land. So this work engages all of those conversations. This work engages the histories of how people relate to land and place and to these stories and to land acknowledgements today, to land back movements, to the difficulty of really transmitting participation in this, colonial settler occupied state of basic calls to returning land to indigenous stewardship, to caring for land with the care that indigenous communities do, etc. So I feel like all that's wrapped into this piece.
I see a lot of chats popping up, and I don't know if there's anything that needs to be vocalized to people in the room that can't see those.
Lots of thank yous, lots of looking forward to the project over the course of the year. And just thank you for the time tonight and for the artwork.
And I saw that there was something said about music, and I did forget to mention that Nicholas is also, music was released on Sub Pop under Yatsin, and it's awesome, so you should listen to that. And there is a piece of music in the Smith Gallery that Nicholas wrote related to the video, the electronic music, correct? Nicholas, yes. I think
Yeah,
that
check out the Sub Pop record that we just released in April. It's Yatsin, album's titled Indian Yard. Yeah.
And I did want to just sort of wrap up by saying that there's a lot of folks that are helping to make this project possible and will make this project possible over the next year. So as I said, we're going to start around November, but the goal is that the project would, run through the winter. The spring, we'll be doing some planting, hopefully harvesting in the summer, and then also we think a second planting and harvesting in the fall. So it's a long-term project. There's a lot of folks involved: grounds, physical plant, history department, environmental studies, Nicholas, the Catawba Nation, the Catawba
Now,
Cultural Center.
Biology and
Biology.
the farm, as Nicholas mentioned, it looks like there will be both the corn planted out here, but also a mass planting at the farm, which will increase the amount of corn that we'll be able to return to the Catawba.
So it's a huge undertaking, and we hope that you will be engaged and involved as the project unfolds. Also wanted to just recognize that it would not be possible without the art department, without the Herb Jackson and Laura Grosch Gallery Endowment, without Steve and Marcy Sands and Davidson Arts and Creative Engagement, and then all of those collaborators that we mentioned. And we hope that we'll be able to bring Nicholas here at some point, maybe to share some corn-related food. What are we making? Cornbread? So I hope that you will continue to stay engaged and follow the project.
I'll bring the smoked salmon.
Oh, whoa, thank you all. Yeah, we'll have lots of good couscous, which is cornbread.
Thank you both for spending so much time. And we, unfortunately, we're sorry that you won't be able to cover this, but everyone here in person is going to join us in the gallery and witness your participatory project. So we'll take some photos for you.
Put together a bed.
Yes, we're going to put together a bed.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye. Thank you.